أهلا وسهلا فيكم في المتحف الفلسطيني. سوري على التأخير الصغير. بدي أعمل مقدمة صغيرة بالعربي بعدين بنبلش مع المحاضرة. فشكرا طبعا لتواجدكم معنا اليوم ومع ضيفتنا العزيزة اللي اجت من مكان بعيد جدا. احنا قبل ما أقدم ساتو وأقدم المحاضرة بس بدي أعمل أعمل ملاحظة نقطتين عن البرنامج. إحنا عم نستضيف اليوم هذا البوك لونش في المتحف. رح نعمل نفس النشاط بعد بكرة في حيفا، بعد بكرة في مقر الثقافة العربية في حيفا، نفس النشاط بالضبط الساعة 6:30 برفقة الدكتور نديم كركبي في مقر جامعة الثقافة العربية. فإذا عندكم أصدقاء في حيفا بليز خبروهم. هذا بعد بكرة يعني يوم الثلاثاء. أما غدا يوم الاثنين في عنا نشاطين في مدينة القدس، وإذا بتحبوا تشاركونا أهلا وسهلا. هلا رح أعطيكم التفاصيل. إذا في عندكم أصدقاء بيحبوا كمان يكونوا متواجدين كمان خبروهم. هلا بكرة الاثنين رح يكون في عنا تجمع في باب الخليل الساعة 4 عشان نعمل رحلة مشي على الأقدام، سير على الأقدام وكمان في الباص. رح يقودها المؤرخ جورج هنتليان أو كيفورك هنتليان حول آثار المعالم للتاريخ المادي الأرمني في مدينة القدس، ولكن المتركز طبعاً على إنجازات الفنان ديفيد أوهانسيان. ونقطة الإذن زي ما حكيت، نقطة البداية رح تكون في باب الخليل الساعة 4 في ساحة عمر بن الخطاب، ونقطة الانتهاء رح تكون في فندق الأمريكان كولوني. وهناك رح يكون في عنا نشاط بوك لونش تاني مع ساتو. راح تكون محاضرة بتركز أكثر على علاقة ديفيد أوهانسيان في الأمريكان كولوني وفي القدس. راح تكون شوي مركزة أكثر على مدينة القدس. هذا بالنسبة للنشاطات. هلأ بالنسبة لليوم، ليش إحنا عاملين هذا النشاط وإحنا ليش استضفنا ساتو؟ دائما احنا بنطلع على شغلنا بشكل كامل ويعني مكتمل. فاحنا دائما المتحف هو يحرص على متحفة الممارسات الثقافية الفلسطينية من خلال محاضرات، من خلال منشورات، ومن خلال المعارض. فمن خلال البرنامج العام عم بنمتحف ممارسة وتاريخ ديفيد أوهانسيان بفلسطين. لماذا تحديداً هذه السنة ولماذا تحديداً هذا الشهر؟ لأنه هذه السنة تصادف مئوية تأسيس فن الخزف الأرمني أو ما سمي بعدين أو اللي هو معروف بفن القيشاني، بس فن الخزف الأرمني المقدسي بمدينة القدس قبل 100 سنة على يد ديفيد أوهانسيان، وذلك من خلال تأسيس ورشة أو معمل قبة الصخرة، اللي هو كان معمل يعني اسمه قبة صخرة متواجد لعدة سنوات، وساتو راح تشرح لنا عنه. هذه طبعا كان السبب الأولاني والآني. السبب طبعا الأوسع هو إنه ضرورة التعرف على ممارسة فنية فلسطينية إحنا نظن إنها فولكلورية فنية مادية وحرفية فلسطينية، يعني خلقت بالقرن العشرين، كأنه يعني هي موجودة من مئات السنوات، بس هي عملياً خلقت ونمت في فلسطين وتجذرت في فلسطين في القرن العشرين على يد ديفيد أوهانسيان. فيعني التقاليد زي ما بتعرفوا دائماً يمكن خلقها. فمثل ما حكيت نأمل أنه بفضل هذه الاستضافة التعرف من قرب على ظروف نشأة هذه الحرفة في فلسطين، ونأمل أن كذلك أن يوسع المعرض الذي ستقيمه جامعة بير زيت العام القادم. نأمل سيوسع هذه المعرفة بتراث ديفيد أوهانسيان من خلال عرض أعماله الفنية، وأن تؤدي ربما من خلال تواجد كلية الفنون الجميلة والتي تضم قسم للتصميم أن تصب في تجديد هذه الحرفة في فلسطين وتوسيع آفاقها مما يعني نعرفه الآن. لأنه إحنا هلأ بنعرف الخزف الأرمني أو الخزف الخليلي، بنعرف التطريز، بنعرف الكوفية. إحنا بنظن إنه بنعرف كل شيء عن تاريخ الكوفية وعن التطريز. هذه فرصة أولاً من خلال هذا النشاط للتعرف على تاريخ دخول هذه وتجذر هذه الحرفة إلى فلسطين، ونأمل من خلال معرض جامعة بير زيت أن تتجدد أدواته مستقبلاً في بداية من العام القادم. بدي أشكر بعض الأفراد اللي متواجدين معنا. طبعاً بدي أشكر شركائنا المكتبة العلمية لكل جهودهم لتوسيع ثقافة القراءة والإقبال على القراءة. هم شركائنا طبعاً اليوم في بيع الكتب وكذلك في استضافة النشاط في الأمريكان كولوني. بدي أشكر كذلك الأستاذ إميل عشراوي الذي هو ساهم في إخراج الكتاب. Yes, you did. وكذلك بدي أشكر خاصة الإخوة جورج الأعمى وأمجد غنام اللي هم طبعاً جامعي للتحف وللفن بفلسطين، وخاصة جامعي للآثار المادية والتحف لديفيد أوهانسيان، ومن خلالهم فن ديفيد أوهانسيان المادي عم بيرجع جمعه إلى فلسطين. فشكراً جورج، شكراً أمجد. آخر إشي طبعاً لازم أحكي عن ساتو. ساتو هي حفيدة ديفيد أوهانسيان. والدتها هلا بديش ألخبط، والدتها مولودة بالقدس، والدتها هي مقدسية وكبرت هي وكل يعني أعمامها في البقعة، وقبل ذلك طبعاً في دير الأرمن في البلد القديمة. ساتو هي عازفة كلاسيكية، بس يعني بتعزف كلاسيكي وموسيقى معاصرة، ومن بسبب وفائها لعائلتها ولإرث الشعب الأرمني والتراث والثقافة الأرمنية ولإرث جدها غيرت حياتها 100%، واعتزلت تقريبا الموسيقى واشتغلت ل3 سنوات شغل مضني في الكتابة وفي البحث. يعني لما تقرأوا الكتاب رح تشوفوا إنه هذا الجيش وقف معاها لكتاب هذا الكتاب، يعني شيء لا يصدق. لماذا؟ لأنه حياة ديفيد أوهانسيان بلشت في قرية صغيرة في شرق تركيا، وحياته المهنية والعائلية والاجتماعية مع كل مآسيها وإنجازاتها هي حياة ما يسمى بمنطقتنا بالشرق الأوسط. فرح تشوفوا هذا من خلال المحاضرة. بدي أحكي عن المحاضرة اليوم. رح تركز ساتو على الجانب التاريخي وعلى الجانب الفني، بس الكتاب مؤثر جدا. أنا مش عارفة كيف كتبته بهي الطريقة، مؤثر جدا، فيه قصص عائلية مؤثرة جدا، قصص شخصية مؤثرة مع الجانب التاريخي طبعا والحرفي، مع إنه هذا هو كتابها الأولاني. حاسة إنه عم بنسى أشياء فرح أوقف. الأشياء الشخصية أثيك راح نخليها في الآخر. فآخر كلمة بدي أحكيها بالنسبة للفورمات، إحنا كان المفروض نعمل دايلوج ولا آخره، بس لأنه المادة اللي بدها تعرضها ساتو كتير زخمة، فرح نخليها تعمل محاضرة مع صور تقريبا نص ساعة. بعد ذلك راح يكون في مجال للأسئلة، وطبعا في ضيافة طبعا بنفس الوقت ولا التوقيع. أوكي، واللي بيشتري كتابين بياخد جائزة من ساتو كمان. فحبيت أحكيها. فشكرا كثير لحضوركم. Thank you Sato so much. I'm so happy you're finally here and we finally did it.
Hello. Yes, we're good. Adila, thank you so much for that incredibly gracious introduction. It's a thrill and an honor to be here in Palestine and to be in this magnificent building, this institution, to elevate the international understanding also of the arts and culture of Palestine. And I was extremely moved to visit the exhibitions downstairs, and I'll never forget what I saw. So, good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. I'd like to thank all the people that Adila thanked, and also especially to thank her who made this whole project come together, as well as the staff and the board of the Palestinian Museum for inviting me here to share the story of my maternal grandfather, the Armenian ceramicist David Ohannessian, who left his mark on Palestinian arts in a popular tradition that we know today as Jerusalem Armenian ceramics. As Dr. Adila mentioned in her very gracious introduction, Armenian ceramics have become ubiquitous, popular in Jerusalem. And for a large international audience, the rich blues and greens and the elegant, timeless motifs of these Palestinian artworks are instantly recognizable. But the story behind the art is somewhat less well known. Where did it originate? And how did it arrive in Palestine? So tonight, I'd like to give a small overview of the life and art of David Ohannessian, and by looking at his life, we'll see how this art was swept up in two tumultuous historical periods: the Armenian Genocide during the First World War, and then, of course, the Nakba. More than a decade ago, when I decided to write my grandfather's biography, I began combing through libraries and archives and writing to scholars. Some of those scholars are here in the room tonight. I wrote to museum curators, auction house experts, anyone whose work touched on my grandfather's métier. I gathered together all the documents that remained in the possession of his grandchildren, and I began to travel the world in search of his traces. So Feast of Ashes, this book, it tells the story of my grandfather's life and times, but it's also the story of my search for him. And in writing the book, I hope to give a more personal perspective of the eras both of the Armenian Genocide and the Nakba. In other words, I wanted to represent them not only from the viewpoint of nations or governments, but as the Palestinian Museum's current program very valuably highlights, from the point of view of one family's intimate terrain. 100 years after Ohannessian's arrival in Palestine as a destitute refugee, the art he founded in 1919 continues to thrive. And although he was never able to fulfill his dream of returning to Jerusalem after 1948 to build a new workshop that would employ some of the many Palestinian refugees who, like him, had fled the violence that forced them from their homes, the ceramics he created and the aesthetic that he transferred from Ottoman Anatolia to Palestine remain today as one of the most distinctive idioms in the visual landscape of Jerusalem. So let's take a look now at some of Ohannessian's most characteristic tile installations around Jerusalem. Outside the Old City, there are many residences from the 1920s and 30s, most often commissioned by distinguished Arab families from local Palestinian architects. These are embellished with Ohannessian's tiles. And as one looks around the city and its neighborhoods, one sees green and blue tiles nestled among the golden building stones. You see them everywhere. His tiles also adorn many public buildings designed by British Mandate architects. And in fact, these Armenian ceramics are now so well integrated into the cityscape that they're often used by international film and art directors as a kind of visual shorthand for Jerusalem. So in this film, this Hannah Arendt's film, she arrives in Jerusalem, this is her first day, and the director seats her in front of Ohannessian ceramics. Here's one of many, many, many press conferences at the American Colony Hotel, and where did the photographer seat these luminaries of various sorts? They seat them in front of Ohannessian ceramics. So for the international viewer, it signifies Jerusalem. So let's look briefly at David Ohannessian's early years and the origins of his art during the late Ottoman Empire. So here we have a map that has the cities that were important in his life. That circle up there shows Muradshah, the village where he was born in 1884, Eskişehir, where he spent his youth, and then, of course, the important Kütahya, where he learned his art. Like many rural families and many Palestinian families as well, our family maintained a strong tradition of storytelling. And in this way, the information about births and deaths and marriages and professions were passed down through the generations. Young Tavit learned that he was in part descended from men who had traveled to this historic Ottoman ceramic center of Kütahya to learn the art. And similarly, my mother, as a child in Palestine, heard all these generations of stories. And in the very last years of her life, she gave us a tremendous gift. She transcribed all of them and made a copy for every member of my generation. So through that, I learned that in 1902, my grandfather, following in the footsteps of his ancestors, also decided to pursue an apprenticeship in ceramics and moved to Kütahya. By 1907, he had mastered the art and opened an independent studio there called the Société Ottomane de Fayence. Here's a satellite view of Western Anatolia. And at the top in the red circle, you see the city of Iznik, which was the chief imperial ceramic-making center of the Ottoman Empire. And 100 miles to the south, we see Kütahya and two other villages that were also rich in the same clays and other minerals that gave rise to this Ottoman tradition of ceramics. They contained, all these regions contained large quantities of kaolin, the soft white china clay that produced the characteristic luminous white backgrounds that we see in the finest Iznik and Kütahya ware. Here's an example of an Iznik basin from the peak of the Iznik production period. This is the early 16th century. So in this period, through the 16th century, the ceramicists produced immense quantities of tiles and tableware for their royal patrons. And Kütahya, with its mineral wealth, but slightly farther away from the Ottoman capital of Constantinople, or Istanbul as we know it today, served as a secondary ceramic center, and they took on the overflow orders from Iznik. What Iznik could not handle, Kütahya took. But at the same time, they developed some very distinctive, immediately recognizable figural styles and other styles that were distinct from the formal imperial styles. Historically, Armenians dominated Kütahya's ceramics trade and also produced Christian votive objects like these eggs adorned with cherubim and crosses. You see these eggs hanging in St. James Cathedral, Armenian Cathedral in Jerusalem. And here's another very typical votive item, a Pilgrim Flask. And if you look at it, you'll see that it resembles quite a few of the Balyan and Karakashian ceramics works from the 20th century. So by the 18th century, production in Iznik had collapsed, and instead huge commissions arrived in Kütahya, including orders for Jerusalem's Armenian Patriarchate and other orders for the decorations of all sorts of buildings throughout the broad Ottoman provinces. At that point in history, the Ottoman Empire was immense. At the same time, through the centuries, the renovation of tiled religious monuments built between the 13th and 18th centuries also provided work for the Kütahya ceramicists. So this whole Anatolian peninsula that you saw on the map earlier suffered from frequent earthquakes and extremes of weather. It was tectonically very complex, and the environment reflected that. So all of that, the weather, the earthquakes, constantly necessitated new tiles to be made for these monuments. However, by the middle of the 19th century, the severely deteriorating economic conditions in the Ottoman Empire left the city's trade subdued, and many major monuments fell into disrepair. Kütahya ceramicists also continued to make and export pottery, principally to England and France. So here are some late 19th century examples. And another one, those of you who are familiar with Jerusalem ceramics will recognize this pattern. So the turn of the 20th century, we're moving ahead in time now, the turn of the 20th century saw a growth of Ottoman nationalism and a growing cry for a more clearly defined Turkish, as opposed to just Ottoman, cultural identity. And a new revivalist architectural style came up that combined distinctive features of classical Ottoman and Seljuk era monuments, including domes, wide eaves, pointed arches, and of course, plenty of tile facades. In 1904, the government commissioned a grand post office in Istanbul in this new mode, and all the Kütahya workshops produced tiles for it. Not only is it tiled on the outside, but the inner court is tiled. You know, they're bringing back the great imperial era where, you know, the sultans at the height of Ottoman power commissioned tiles. So with the founding of Ohannessian's workshop in 1907, Kütahya had three major ceramic studios, those of Mehmet Emin, the Minassian brothers, and David Ohannessian, whose name is, as it often was, misspelled in this French trade journal, but it's clear who they're talking about. All around Istanbul today, how many of you have been to Istanbul? Anyone? Oh, yes, a lot of you. Okay, so all around Istanbul today, you see tiles from this period. These are traces of the Turkish and Armenian ceramicists from this early 20th century period. This is the Haydarpaşa boat landing. Many of the boat landings in Istanbul have tiled facades. Moving forward, still in time, the 1908 Young Turk Revolution, the government convened new efforts to address the accumulated damage to the great historic monuments. So again, all three studios worked closely with the director appointed by the government, the leading architect whose name was Ahmed Kemalettin, or Mimar Kemalettin, and they produced renovation tiles. And during this period, Ohannessian achieved wide renown as an expert in historic renovations. In 1911, he met someone who would change the course of his life. That month, the British Member of Parliament, Mark Sykes, whom we know, unfortunately, better for his infamous 1916 Sykes-Picot Agreement, traveled to Istanbul on a diplomatic mission. And during this trip, he made a detour to Kütahya, because several months earlier, his family manor called Sledmere House in Yorkshire had burned to the ground. And Sykes is, I guess we would call him an Orientalist today in the way we all understand this word. He was very enamored of the East, and he had decided that he wanted to build a very grand tiled room with a fireplace. The thing is, he had learned that in Kütahya, there were people who were still carrying forward this ceramic tradition that had remained essentially unbroken for centuries. So he, in his point of view, sought out, as it turned out, David Ohannessian, and he gave him this immense commission. After the tiles were installed in 1914, many visitors from his aristocratic social circle and British Foreign Office visited the rebuilt Sledmere House, and they admired Ohannessian's work. So chief among those visitors was Sykes' very good friend, another name you will recognize, Ronald Storrs. So this success in Kütahya slowed, of course, with the Ottoman entry into war in November of 1914. And a few months later, in early 1915, the Ottoman government began rounding up, massacring, and exiling Armenians, ushering in a 2-year period of mass violence and displacement for most of the empire's more than 2 million Armenian citizens. So these catastrophic events collectively are known as the Armenian Genocide. David Ohannessian was also swept up in it. In December of 1915, in Kütahya, he was arrested and falsely accused of engaging in revolutionary activity. He, his wife, Victoria, and their 3 very young children were deported from Kütahya. And like other Armenians who were deported from the western provinces of the Ottoman Empire, they followed the rail line to its end in Bozanti, and from there, the guards organized caravans of Armenians, including my grandparents and their young children, and marched them through a grueling route through the Taurus and Amanus Mountains through to the Arab provinces. So during this long forced march, Ohannessian contracted a very serious case of typhus and almost died, but the family reached Aleppo later in 1916. December of 1917, here you see a scene outside of St. James Cathedral. This is a photo from the archives of the Red Cross that was recently uploaded to the Library of Congress, photo collection. And these are people who have survived deportation. They're waiting to be admitted to the convent. So in December of 1917, British General Edmund Allenby and his army, as we all know, conquered Jerusalem, bringing to an end 4 centuries of Ottoman rule. And the newly installed military governor, Ronald Storrs, wrote that the most serious, most urgent problem was the shortage of food. The city was also filling rapidly with many thousands of Armenian refugees and orphans who were survivors of the massacres and deportations. While Storrs and his fellow British officers addressed the widespread famine in this period and serious illnesses that were raging through Jerusalem, they were also confronted with a need to rebuild the city. Storrs was particularly attentive to the needs of historic preservation. He had studied classics at Cambridge University, and he recruited designers and architects from abroad, and he appointed leaders from Jerusalem's diverse religious communities to oversee all the planning that fell outside the scope of a military administration. In September of 1918, this new pro-Jerusalem society, as they called it, began its official duties. And high on the list, of course, was the restoration of the major holy sites, especially the badly damaged tile work on the Dome of the Rock. So, as you know, Suleiman the Magnificent left his mark on the structure in the mid-16th century when he ordered the building to be covered with colorful ceramic tiles, Persian tiles. Jerusalem's extremes of weather, once again, regularly damaged the tiles, but Palestine's parched geology and landscape lacked the clays and other minerals that were necessary to replicate the technique of the original tiles. So in the centuries following Suleiman's reclothing this beautiful structure with tiles, repair materials were imported along with workers who patched and replaced tiles and then returned to their home regions. Among the experts invited to Jerusalem in 1918 was British architect Ernest T. Richmond, who surveyed the structure and asked whether the 16th century method of decoration with glazed tiles could be continued in the future or would it need to be abandoned. Another expert invited, Charles Ashby, who is a designer and leader in the British arts and crafts movement, echoed this question. Ashby hoped to introduce or revive the arts of glass-blowing, weaving, and tile-making as resident industries in Jerusalem. And in November of 1918, after the British conquered Aleppo, Mark Sykes's final British office mission, Foreign Office mission, led him to Jerusalem, where he too saw the condition of the holy sites. So you see how these characters are converging now. 2 weeks after his visit to Jerusalem, where he observed the Dome of the Rock and its condition, he arrived in Aleppo to establish a provisional government for the British. Among his tasks was to interview the Armenian survivors. There were like maybe 50,000 Armenian survivors of deportation in Aleppo at that time. During this period, during these few days in early December, he re-encountered Ohannessian and connected him with Ronald Storrs in Jerusalem. And a number of other British officers had also taken a deep interest in the repair of the Dome of the Rock. Throughout the whole British network, people were looking to see, are any in Damascus, are any in Kashan, where can we find tiles? Some of them had seen Ohannessian's tile work in Sledmere House and agreed when Sykes recommended him to the Pro-Jerusalem Society. So here I have a note that I found one day as I was researching in the British National Archives in Kew. I was just sitting and going through a folder having to do with the Dome of the Rock when I found this handwritten note which says, as to the new tiles which are required, I should do it with a British accent, Sir Mark Sykes got an Armenian to make him a tiled room in his Yorkshire place of modern tiles, successfully imitating the Damascus tiles. If he has not been massacred in the interval, he might provide the necessary tiles. So that's just a research meta experience, sitting there reading about your grandfather discussed like that. So anyway, to continue, the Ohannessians arrived in Palestine at the end of 1918, and Tavit began a series of experiments to test the local clays and woods for their suitability for ceramics. Later in the year, with the assistance of the British military administration, he returned to Kütahya at his own request and obtained the needed clays and other minerals which he had not been able to find in Palestine. He brought back with him to Jerusalem Nishan Balyan, a very gifted wheel potter, and the expert painter Mugardish Karakashian, and several other men and women ceramicists. And he was given the use of a building on the Via Dolorosa by the Waqf, and he named his new workshop the Dome of the Rock Tiles. He cooperated with the Near East Relief and trained scores of young Armenian orphans and then employed them in the trade, helping them achieve financial self-sufficiency, which was the main objective of this giant American philanthropy. The studio created great quantities of pottery for retail sale and export. And at the same time, Ohannessian and his artisans created and installed replacement tiles on the dome of the rock, effecting a partial renovation to stave off further damage until a full renovation could be completed. Ohannessian used the expertise he had gained as a successful workshop owner in Kütahya to promote his products and to develop international export channels, as he had done earlier. The Pro-Jerusalem Society in Ashby gave Ohannessian many important commissions. One of them was to produce street name tiles for the Old City. And here we see the trilingual tiles as they were made during the mandatory period with English, Arabic, and Hebrew. That was the order of the languages. After two violent uprisings in 1920 and 21, the newly formed Supreme Muslim Council allowed Palestine's Muslim community a greater degree of control over its own holy sites. The council hired Ahmet Kemalettin to come from Istanbul to supervise the restoration of the Dome of the Rock and all the structures in Al-Aqsa. When he arrived in Jerusalem, Kemalettin, who had of course worked frequently with Ohannessian during his Kütahya years, praised the ceramicist's work very highly. But the architect's strong sense of nationalism had also endured, and Kemalettin insisted that the tiles must be manufactured in Turkey and shipped to Jerusalem. So Ohannessian and his fellow artists were stopped from completing this project. Another Ashby project with Ohannessian was a faience model of the Dome of the Rock as a present from a group of Palestinian Muslims on the occasion of the British Princess Mary's 1922 wedding. Also in 1922, Balyan and Karakashian left Ohannessian's employ. They founded their own joint studio in a building they had rented outside the Old City on Nablus Road. This would become Palestine's second Armenian ceramics workshop. So here's the Ohannessian family in 1923, one of many families in Palestine working very hard to recreate order and prosperity after years of war and trauma. Many Palestinian families devastated by the Great War were doing the same thing. They were rebuilding businesses and regaining the prosperity that they had achieved before the war. And as they succeeded in reviving their businesses, they hired local Palestinian architects to design villas and apartment buildings. So in the 1920s and 30s, Ohannessian carried over to Jerusalem this Ottoman tradition of exterior architectural tile embellishment, especially for domestic projects. This was a new thing in Jerusalem. One Palestinian architect with whom Ohannessian collaborated frequently was Spiro Huri, who cultivated bonds with some of Jerusalem's most successful businessmen through his membership as a Freemason in the Grand Lodge of Palestine. Another notable family, led by Hana Ibrahim Bisharat, built for his family this gorgeous stone mansion called the Villa Harun al-Rashid. This very elegant home was adorned with Ohannessian ceramics. And as all new construction in Jerusalem under the mandatory government was required to be made of the local limestone, these tiled decorations that we see here offered bursts of color against the golden stone. Maybe this is the tradition we'd like to see in Ramallah. So here we see more examples. Sometimes they were grand expanses of tiles, and sometimes it was a single tile or a very, very small ceramic object embedded into the exterior of these houses. And many of them are still in place today. In Jerusalem, Ohannessian also expanded the range of his iconography, sometimes including imagery inspired by Armenian illuminations. But of course, the image of St. George is also deeply tied to Palestinian culture. So here's a snapshot from a private collection in London to show the range of brilliant colors and the intensity of the hues used in this Jerusalem pottery of the 1920s and 30s. Another example of Ohannessian's work. And yet another example after he had discovered how to reproduce the yellow color, which took him a few years to find what he needed to do that. So today, a number of Palestinian and international connoisseurs are building important collections of this art. Some of these Palestinian and international connoisseurs are in this room at this very moment. And with luck, we'll all see their collections next year at Birzeit. University Museum. Over time, Ohannessian rebuilt his export network and distributed his wares through such outlets as the American Colony stores in Jerusalem and New York City and Liberties of London. He participated in international shows, including the 1925 Paris Expo of Decorative Arts, 1931 Paris Colonial Exposition, and the Chicago World's Fair of 1933-34. He took Palestinian art to Chicago and sold a tremendous amount of it, and also gained lots of commissions for installations of Palestinian, Armenian, Jerusalem ceramics in the United States. We're still trying to find where all of them are located, but some of the mysteries have been solved in the book. So Ohannessian created monumental installations in the Middle East, Europe, and the United States, and again, many of these works remain in place. Here are some Palestinian tiles from the 1920s in Corbie in northern France. This is part of a much larger room, entirely tiled, which is in what's now a luxurious small hotel called Le Macassar in Corbie. And Ohannessian, through all of this, rigorously attempted to preserve the historic Anatolian ceramic making techniques, even in the face of Palestine's very different geological environment and the lack of the specific clays and minerals that had characterized the Anatolian ceramic tradition. To the end of his career in the 1940s, he maintained the use of a wood-burning kiln, and he ground glazes from raw minerals. During his 3 decades in Palestine, Ohannessian also designed and executed lots of architectural tile work for new structures designed by British Mandate architects. And the most complex of these Jerusalem projects was a fountain niche of cuerda seca tile for a new museum funded by the American industrialist John D. Rockefeller, intended to display the Holy Land's antiquities. In 1938, architect Austin St. Barb Harrison's romantic building called the Palestine Archaeological Museum and featuring Ohannessian's tiles opened to the public. But I think perhaps the most personal, the most poignant of Ohannessian's creations in Jerusalem may be the now badly damaged memorial altar created in 1928 for the Armenian convent of St. Saviour. It bears a dedication tile made by Ohannessian 10 years after he had first arrived in Jerusalem as a destitute refugee. The inscribed tile reads, in classical Armenian, David Ohannessian of Kutahya, in the year of the Lord 1919, established the art of ceramics in Jerusalem, and in his workshop prepared the tiles of this holy altar, dedicated at the gate of St. Saviour Monastery in memory of his parents and all the deceased, in the year of the Lord 1928, during the Patriarchate of Archbishop Yerishe Turian. A 1944 article in the Palestine Post celebrated the 25th anniversary of Armenian pottery in Jerusalem, and it characterized Ohannessian as a, quote, artist of the old type, worthy of the tradition he has carried over to our days. Not a single bowl, vase, or tile is allowed to leave his factory, which has not been completely made by hand, and whose color and glaze have not been mixed under his own eyes. He continued to produce pottery and tiles in his workshop on the Via Dolorosa until the beginning of 1948, when he was compelled to shutter the building. One by one, his family had fled the bombings and sniper fire that had killed some of their immediate neighbors in Baka. The family scattered to England, Soviet Armenia, Damascus. David remained in his home until the very end of April 1948, when he left for Cairo. He expected the war to end soon and his family to be reunited. But of course, as we all know, this did not happen. In 1950, still in Cairo, he began drawing up plans with the Egyptian architect Hassan Fatih Bey for a new, much larger workshop in Jerusalem, as we mentioned earlier, one that might employ as many as 400 Palestinian refugees. And over a 2-year period, he applied for aid to the United Nations Works and Relief Agency, but ultimately the project failed. He died in Beirut in 1953. The retiling of the Dome of the Rock was not completed until the mid-1960s. In the end, the tiles were made in Kütahya by the Chiniciolu firm and, indeed, shipped to Jerusalem. The joint Balyan-Karakashian workshop continued operating until the deaths of the original partners in the 1960s. Their descendants opened separate workshops with an ever-increasing variety of work. In 1954, the French-Armenian painter Marie Alexanian married into the family and introduced an original design vocabulary to Jerusalem tile work. In 1992, the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C. honored her with a solo exhibition. The Balian Family Workshop remains on Nablus Road, outside the Old City. And the workshop continues to incorporate new kinds of design ideas and advanced technologies into their creations. The Karakashian family continues to produce exquisite pottery and tiles in their studio and shop on Greek Orthodox Patriarchate Street in Jerusalem. They've preserved traditional designs and forms. They're continually enlarging their own repertoire. They have also created street tiles for Jerusalem. You see that the languages, the order of the languages is now quite different. Here we have a little video of Hagop Karakashian, the grandson of Mogradich Karakashian in my grandfather's generation. He's at work in his studio and he continues to practice hand decoration in the time-honored manner. And other Armenian families have also more recently founded studios in Jerusalem. The Sandruni brothers, Garo, George, and Harry, each with his own shop, although I think Harry may have moved back to Canada. But at one point, all three of them had shops in Jerusalem, produced beautiful ceramics, and they've also documented the history very well. So they continue to make beautiful objects of their own. And another entry to the current generation of Jerusalem Armenian ceramicists is Vik Lepedjian and also Hagop Antriasian, who continues with the very traditional designs. So although David Ohannessian's career came to an end in 1948, the art that he established in Palestine in 1919, these Armenian ceramics of Jerusalem, continue to survive, thrive, and inspire. Although the glazes, designs, and colors evoke the distant past, the art itself is just 100 years old. Established after the losses, hardships, and displacements of the Great War, it continues to pour forth today with a very vibrant life, a transformed branch of an old Ottoman Armenian tradition replanted in Palestine and now inextricably woven into the panorama of Jerusalem.
It's frustratingly short for somebody who read the book. You know, it's just amazing. But I hope everybody got really the gist of what of the story. It's very, very short for somebody who actually read the book. So I hope that you will all read the book. It's really an amazing achievement. Again, congratulations for writing this and piecing this story. And it's also an achievement for condensing it into this very short presentation. Congratulations, it's also wonderful. I'm supposed to ask you questions, but I'm going to make a long comment and then ask you a leading question. Yes, yes, please.
I also want to thank this woman. I've known Attila now for quite a few years. We met on Instagram, commented on ceramics.
The microphone seems to be switching off or mute.
Thank you. And she is one of the many scholars who so generously and ceaselessly answered questions, translated Arabic, searched on Arabic websites, and solved a few mysteries that had plagued me for many, many years. So I want to express my gratitude for that as well.
It was a great pleasure, really. Great distraction from what I was otherwise doing. And I was telling Sato that in some of the documents that I found, there was some signatures by her grandfather signed in Arabic, Dahoud Bilha, Dahoud Ohannessian, when he was working here. Anyway, I just want to make a general comment and then to ask you something about the Palestinian part or the Jerusalem part of the story. First, when you read the book, when you start reading the book, which starts with the macro history of the Armenian people and, you know, things becoming worse and worse and worse, and so the collective story, and you cannot be, you cannot but, you know, recall or notice the flagrant similarities with the plight of the Palestinians, past and obviously ongoing. And this is, in the story of the Armenian people, there are really some profound lessons, obviously, for us to discern, but I think more when you read the before, the preparations. So the collective story is a Palestinian story, but the micro story is a very Palestinian story. It's unbelievable, the detail. First of all, David Ohannessian started his working career at the age of 14. This is why he was able to have a successful workshop in Kutahya before World War I, and he was able to have such an illustrious client like Mark Sykes, because he was already working in his 20s. Even before he came to Palestine, he was very well established. But to go back to the family, the story of, you know, surviving all the injustices that happened to the family and that you graciously avoided mentioning here, and the death march, and then ending up in Halab, and then what they did in Halab, and then when they came here and living in the convent, and then making your way out of the convent and living in Baqa, and then being forced to leave Jerusalem and spreading and trying to survive and building a life anew after surviving everything. Again, building a life from scratch, trying in Damascus, in Beirut, and in Cairo. It's mind-boggling, the strength of the human spirit. Obviously, the human spirit is unstoppable, but in the case of your family, it's really unstoppable. And before I ask my question, I would like to say that also you didn't mention that, okay, we are focusing on the Palestinian story, and I will focus here with my question, but it's important to note that also David Ohannessian, either personally or when he was working in Turkey, he did work which is found in the UK, in manors, in palaces, in mosques in Beirut, in the Haram in Mecca, and in the Manial Palace, the famous Manial Palace, which still exists to this day, at the beginning when it was built, and then when he left Palestine, he also got a commission. This is how he got his Egyptian visa, actually,
exactly,
to work on the Manial Palace. Anyway, so that's the regional parenthesis. But to go back, so you just mentioned briefly that the family ended up living in Baqa, and that you ended up having to leave in 48. And then your grandfather tried to come back with the UNRWA, tried to reopen, this is what's remarkable, he tried to come back and reopen the workshop in Jerusalem. So we know all this in the book, but I'd like to know something more personal, if you can tell us something more personal about your mother, who was born in Jerusalem, who grew up in Jerusalem, as some of your other relatives, and she is a Jerusalemite.
Yeah.
And then how she carried that with her into her exiles and also to you, besides the ceramics.
Yeah, she was, my mother, you know, was an absolutely wonderful person, born in Baqa, educated in the convent, and then Jerusalem Girls College. Later, you know, after the Nakba, she ended up at American University of Beirut. But she loved Jerusalem, she loved Palestine, she loved, you know, she had such a sensory memory of it, even to the very end of her life. She remembered what the herbs tasted like. She remembered the fruits and the vegetables from the market. And there was this just sadness that hung in our house, you know, that she couldn't go back. She spent the years between 1948 and into the 1950s without any kind of passports, you know, just going from 3-month visa to 3-month visa to 3-month visa. She survived riots and the burning of Cairo in 1952. I mean, she was quite traumatized by the time she arrived in the United States. And yet we always, my brother and I, heard the stories of Jerusalem, the Bethlehem Road, the olive trees, the friendliness and the interaction of the people, the way the children played together, and Armenian children taught a few words of Armenian to Spanish kids, and Spanish kids taught Arabic kids taught, you know, I mean, they spoke this melange of languages, and this feeling of warmth was something that was a loss to her for her entire life. So she cooked the food that she had learned to make, and Jerusalem came out of her mouth multiple times a day, and yet she never returned.
Yes. Another intimate question, if I may. One of the things that I personally that I like about David Ohannessian's work, because it's not somebody who happened to be important in Turkey and then he came and he established this art form. It's also, and this is why I was mentioning in my introduction that I hope that maybe with the University of Birzeit Fine Art Department, the Samir Aweda Fine Art Department, if I may, with our beloved Samir Aweda here in the audience, that hopefully with the exhibition that hopefully we hope that Birzeit University will be able to organize, and then hopefully the Fine Arts Department at the university will be able to spotlight this art form and that it will renew itself. But what I wanted to say is that what struck me about his work is that there is the massive work, the big tile panels, which are absolute, for me it was like a piece of paradise. But also he managed, for commercial necessity, to invent like applications in small objects.
Yes.
But what's characteristic about these objects, it's not like cut and paste motif and you make it smaller. He created this very rich and intimate world of beasts and fauna, fauna obviously, and flora, which is self-contained in the vase and in the bowl, which is so intimate and so beautiful, and you feel like you're owning this completely new original. And I'm amazed that he was able to reinvent from doing these massive government commissions to doing these beautiful pieces that some of the people here in the audience are lucky to own. But tell me, if you want, please, share with us when you went to Sledmere House for the first time and what you felt. I mean, we don't have these large buildings here. We have some of the panels, but why don't you tell us just about that?
Well, Sledmere House was the first of the massive tile installations that I visited, and I had always, of course, been interested in my grandfather's life. I was very close to my Aunt Serapi, the eldest of Ohannessian's 7 children, and she was the family historian. And the art historian, so to speak, of the family. And she had always stressed that Ohannessian considered his huge tile installations to be his masterpieces. And I really didn't know what to expect with Sledmere because all I had seen were like some black and white photos and some bad reproductions of, one corner of one wall. But when I finally entered the room and saw the kind of brilliant colors that you see in miniature here, you see in this immense expanse, and yet the details are perfectly drawn. I just burst into tears. It was like the air was sucked out of my lungs and the tears just came. And not only was I moved by the beauty and the sort of perfection of the design and the way in which these very traditional motifs had been recombined into a new configuration, but I felt my grandfather's presence, and I'll never forget. And to tell you the truth, I've only been there once because it was such a spiritual experience that I was afraid I might not be able to reproduce it in a second visit.
Yes, of course. Thank you, Sato. Thank you for sharing.
Could I mention one
Yes.
more thing about this wonderful point that you made about the intimacy of these small pieces? So, of course, as a workshop owner in Kütahya, he produced not only tiles, but also pottery for export. But when he arrived in Jerusalem, he had a new problem to contend with, which is that the city was filled with orphaned children. And he had, in his previous career, trained many apprentices, but now he had children who were 6, 7, 8 years old, being sponsored by, this Near East Relief, the Armenian Convent, the AGBU, all kinds of philanthropic organizations. And they had to find a way to contribute to their upkeep and ultimately to train to enter some kind of profession. By the Near East Relief, it was required that you would be prepared to practice a profession by the time you were 16 years old. And so he started producing these very small, very loosely drawn pieces, which, you can find them on eBay, you can find them in many places. Although the drawings are not necessarily so masterful, the colors always maintain the intensity, and you feel the heft of the clay. And I used to think before I knew better that these are these don't represent anything, but what they represent is the efforts of orphaned children, many of whom had lost their entire extended family, who were pouring themselves, as you saw in some of these pictures, into the stillness of making these ceramic pieces. So these are equally to be treasured.
Thank you. So let's have some questions, please. Salim, تفضل.
Can you, yeah, I'm sorry, oh, there you go.
Yeah, the question is about Kutahya.
About what?
Kutahya. We know from the records that Charles Ashby was critical in bringing the Armenian practitioners from Kutahya around.
That's actually not correct. The records are not correct in that respect.
Well, that's what I know,
Yeah,
so
yeah.
that's why I'm asking you.
Yeah.
Well, basically the revival of glass work and textiles,
Yes.
and especially ceramics, began in Jerusalem, according to Ashby, in 1919, 1920. So my question to you is, can you clarify how the Kutahya connection linked with the workshops that Ashby did, and if there were already Armenians working, and maybe non-Armenians also, in Jerusalem and Palestine before that period, before they brought the people to work on the Dome of the Rock, and what was the connection with Ohannessian?
Okay, so one of the main motivations for me to write this book was that as I was growing up and as I was in university, I was reading absolutely everything that had been published, and I saw that, you know, there were overt errors. I mean, and one person would publish something that was completely incorrect, then the next person would rely on that source, et cetera, et cetera. So they entered into this narrative. So this is what I found from you know, an intensive, many years long period of digging into primary sources, going to archives in England, going to Mark Sykes' archives, the National Archives, going to the Ottoman archives, archives in Jerusalem, etc. So here's the timeline. Armenian ceramicists from Kutahya had come in the 19th century and probably earlier to participate in the in the major restorations of the Dome of the Rock, because I shouldn't probably get into too much detail because I don't want to put everybody to sleep. Although this is all in the book, you'll find the answer to your question all in the book. They would come, they would bring the materials with them, and then they would go. And in fact, I found documents in the Ottoman archives discussing, you know, how much we need, how many tiles do we need, do we bring the men from Kutahya to Jerusalem, or do we send a designer from Jerusalem to Kutahya, you know. So there are actually many more documents that were waiting to be discovered. There wasn't a resident tradition of polychrome underglaze ceramics in Jerusalem. There were, of course, many people making pottery, but it wasn't this kind of glazed, you know, underglazed polychrome tradition that Ohannessian brought from Kutahya. So Sykes had learned from Mimar Kemalettin in 1910 that the industry in Kutahya was reviving. And when Sledmere House burned and Sykes went to Kutahya, he met my grandfather, who was the only one of the ceramicists who also spoke French, another accident of fate. And perhaps for that reason, perhaps because they had a common language, or perhaps because he liked my grandfather, we don't know, he gave him this huge commission. That was the connection. Those tiles were installed in Yorkshire at the beginning of 1914. Ronald Storrs had visited several times and seen it. And, you know, in this period between 1914 and the beginning of the war, a lot of British had visited Sykes in Sledmere House and had seen these ceramics. Okay, so Storrs didn't remember, like, the name of Ohannessian or anything like that. And then you can imagine the fog of war and, you know, all these deportations and, you know, huge deaths, violence, the demise of these empires. The British end up in Jerusalem. They are fixated on new tiles for the Dome of the Rock, and at the same time they are terrified of what might happen if they're taking one of the most sublime and sacred Islamic monuments and putting their own tiles on it. This was a terrifying prospect. And between the fact that they had trained in classics and were interested in archaeology and all that, and also that they were terrified at the responsibility toward the Muslims and the possibility that, you know, there might be anger or conflagration if they made an error in retiling this thing. They paid a lot of attention, and the word kind of spread throughout, very broadly throughout the British networks. How can we find a way to retile the Dome of the Rock? So it was just an accident of fate that Mark Sykes ended up in Aleppo in November of 1918 to establish a British provisional government there, that Ohannessian, who had survived, you know, this long exile and destitution, happened to re-encounter him there when he was interviewing Armenian survivors, and that Sykes wrote to Ronald Storrs. Ronald Storrs immediately wrote back and said, "I hope to profit from your tile researches." Ohannessian paid his own way to Jerusalem. The family went there. They stayed in the Vank. Meanwhile, Ashby was in England. Yes, Ashby and Richmond very much wanted to start a new ceramics tradition there because of the need to retile the Dome of the Rock, but also they thought this would be a good thing. Ashby, you know, had seen his efforts at reestablishing guilds and arts and crafts things in, you know, the Cotswolds, et cetera, collapse in the war, and he was very eager to put all these, you know, exiles, refugees to work making crafts. You know, and also this was a way of employing all the Jerusalemites who had survived the war, who were impoverished. Ashby went back to England to bring his family, and while he was gone, Ohannessian showed up, but Storrs already knew who he was. So Ashby and Storrs and Sykes and a lot of the British had kind of set the table. And then an act of fate, I consider it an act of God, that all these circumstances combined, that Sykes happened to be in Aleppo, that all these people happened to have seen Ohannessian's work in Sledmere, that my grandfather happened to bump into Sykes. They happened to be embarked on a, you know, this quest to find a way to retile the Dome of the Rock. All these things came together and landed my grandfather, who was already, you know, a renowned expert in historical restoration, tile maker, et cetera, landed him in Jerusalem. The Waqf approved him. And that's also a part that's like very much left out of the traditional narrative. What was the role of Jerusalem's Muslim leaders? Because they too played an important part in the reestablishment of this tradition in Jerusalem. Anyway, so that was probably way too long an answer, but what I want to stress is that there were many, many coincidences, and if all of them had not come together perfectly, I might not be here today.
Thank you. لحظة بس. The book actually is a very interesting way to learn about the pro-Jerusalem society and the work that they did. We know that, of course, they had in mind this colonialist mentality to rematerialize, you know, the fantasized Jerusalem, but it also talks about their concrete efforts. They try to revive not only the ceramics, but also glassworks. Hebron glass, and also
cotton weaving.
Exactly. And of course, it's very clear that this Dome of the Rock business was terrifying them, that they were afraid it was going to collapse, and they would be blamed for it. And also, it's very important to mention that your grandfather was very much aware that he wanted to be independent and open his own business commercially very soon.
Yeah.
Anyway, شكرا. تفضلي.
point you start? Oh, sorry. Yeah, I'm asking about the effort you had to put to like write the book, and what's the point that make you start to write the book? I mean, I know it's a family history, but like there are a lot of documents you have to review. There are a lot of places to review. Like you said, he came from Kutahya. That like, did you go to Kutahya to know some resource?
Yeah.
Like, like a shortcut about the effort and the starting point that you say, I'm gonna write the book.
Well, I never arrived at the point where I said, I'm going to write a book. I was just obsessively researching, and then finally several people all at the same time said, you must write a book. And I said, okay, I'll try. And then very quickly, Stanford University Press gave me a contract. But I think it's extremely important for families who have preserved histories of any sort and who have a family member who's capable of going into archives and doing sort of collateral research to understand the family stories better, to absolutely do that. I mean, it's so important that we understand history from the point of view not only of the nations and the governments, but also of the individual. And of course, you know, Professor Tamari over here has made incredible efforts along those lines, and the works that he's published and edited have been an immense inspiration.
شكرا.
So if you're thinking of doing it yourself, if you're asking on your own behalf, just do it. And also record the voices of the elders in your family. Record, you know, the oldest people that you have, and engage them in conversation and keep their stories, because these are so precious.
But she asked you also if you went to Kutahya. Not only she went to Kutahya and she was received officially by all the local authority in Turkey, but you found the village, the original village, Muratçay, and that's a very moving experience, which is in the book. Very moving.
Thank you.
We're not going to go there. So, another question, please. Okay. Yes, please, Vera.
Question, because you didn't mention it at all, and I'm intrigued to see your opinion about that. I know at one point in the 60s, a lot of workers from Hebron started their workshops in Hebron imitating the Armenian pottery of Jerusalem. I think some of the workers who had actually been employed in the Balyan and Karkashian workshops were the ones who took the trade out of the workshops and started the business in Hebron, which is now flourishing and known as the Hebron pottery, rather than, without people being aware that it was, that part of it, the origin of it was the Armenian pottery, which was brought in from Kutahya and Turkey. I wanted to know your personal opinion about that, whether you feel it's a positive thing that the pottery has flourished in one way or another, or not.
Well, I think, you know, clearly they're inspired by the, you know, the first generation of the Armenian Jerusalem ceramics, and you know, I'm kind of open to the idea of experimentation. I know that, you know, some people like to preserve the past as it was done and, you know, incrementally build on that, and then some are, you know, making laser spray versions of things on tiles. You know, each of these things has its place, and if the Hebron tradition is creating a livelihood with these, you know, lovely small objects made in quantity, then, you know, is it really very different from the orphan children who were doing, you know, these pieces? So I don't really know much about the history of it, but
and definitely the Hebron pottery is, the Armenian pottery is distinct by its artistry, and of course the others is very highly commercial. It's for tourists and stuff, and they do a lot of silk screen and reproduction, and yeah, but I'm just intrigued to see that what is the connection and how it will continue from there on, whether more Armenians would come and continue.
Yeah, I don't feel sad about that. I would just want to see the artisanal work at the highest standard continue alongside. And I will say that my grandfather was probably the last ceramicist, both in Kutahya and Jerusalem, to use a wood-fired kiln. And the quality of the glazes is distinct. I mean, you can tell what's made in wood and what's made by gas firing. So all these things have a place, I guess. I'd like to learn more about it.
But actually what I would like to say about this, when you read the book from a Palestinian point of view, standpoint, and then you come to his work, when he was fully established and working, we know what was happening in Palestine at the same time, that there were a number of visual artists who were working, and also we had the Badran brothers who were reviving the Islamic crafts. And this is a very small, nowadays it's a small town and it's a small country. How was it then? So I hope that, I was saying that hopefully Birzeit University, the exhibition, and maybe the Fine Arts School, maybe the students will be inspired, or the professors, to revive the craft. But I think, and to modernize it, the designs, I mean. But most importantly, I think that I hope that somehow there will be Palestinian researchers who will dig into that research, into the rich cultural, material history of Jerusalem at that period, and maybe trace the relationships between Ohannessian, between Jamal Badran, between Nahil Bshara, and also maybe the projects that they tried to do, the projects that they didn't try to do, or their map that constellation. So this cries out to be mapped, but I think you have shown the way, and I hope that, this is something that will be happening in the future. I also forgot to mention something very important that we are doing at the museum. We're not only doing the book launches and the tour, we're also doing something really wonderful, if I say so myself, for children with the Sandruni workshop, يعني مشكورين. We will be publishing a booklet which we will be selling in the shop for children. It will be an activity guide with stencils and with drawings that children can fill. We will have copies in Arabic or copies in English, or both. يعني bilingual. This will be for sale here, and you will be able to buy them around the holidays, Christmas time, to give to your grandchildren and to your nieces and nephews as a memento of this event that we did. And actually Sato is collaborating with our residing children's activities genius, Hana Rashid, on developing this booklet. So this is something to look out for, please, in the shop.
Because the booklet incorporates a number of Ohannessian's original stencils.
بالضبط.
Yeah.
So this will be something that will stay هون بالمتحف. شكرا، يعطيكم العافية. بليز تفضلوا عشان تشتروا الكتاب.